Live from Portland, it's Friday, City Club Friday Forum. Welcome to Now What? The impact of the 2004 election with political science professor Bill Lunch and Oregonian political writer Jeff Mapes is our guest today. And we're at the newly remodeled studios of Portland Community Television, which is funded by franchise fees from cable companies. And I would like to mention our subsidized supporters, who are McEwen Gisvold LLP, Medico Support Services Inc., and The Standard, who make our broadcasts possible in part. So welcome, I'm Corleen Kraft, president of the club, and we're excited to be in a live studio. No lip syncing is going to be allowed today. And if you would be kind enough to turn off your cell phones and other noise-making devices, I'd be pleased, and so would everyone else. A few announcements quickly. We have moved. City Club offices are now in their new location, ground floor, right across from O'Brien Park, which is the corner of 9th and Washington. Yeah, I was thinking it was Park, but it's 901 Southwest Washington. Cafe Voila will open on Monday. We have people in. We still have some boxes around, but it's looking really good. Looking forward to having people come and see it, because it will be the new home of all of our meetings that we've typically had in various places and in little cubby holes. Well, we're going to have new leaders councils there. We'll have citizens read there. We'll have the issue committees meet there. So it's going to be our place. We now are not just a city club sort of in our minds. We are a city club that is a place. Really exciting. We are still, and I think possibly as you came in, you may have noticed some art objects outside. We are raffling those to help us furnish our new City Club Commons. It has a really beautiful new marmoleum floor, but it's cold if you have to sit on it. So what we're trying to do is raffle, and we're trying to raise money in many ways, but one of the ways that you get a really big benefit out of instantaneously is you can buy raffle tickets at $5 a piece for any of those 5 art objects out there. So please feel generous, because you'll benefit in more ways than one. Next Friday Forum will be back in the Governor Hotel, and our program will be how campaign finance reform could affect Portland politics. Very timely, and looking forward to that. It's co-sponsored by a group called Money in Politics Research Action. We'll have Money in Politics Research Action Project. We'll have Gary Blackmer, City of Portland Auditor, Carrie Bolton, who's a national advocate for campaign finance reform, and Mark Spitzer, who's the Arizona Corporations Commissioner. I was wondering if he's related to Elliot Spitzer of New York City fame. In any case, I did want to mention as well that all of the information about what's happening can be found on our website at pdxcityclub.org, and you can also take part in our blogs at that location. Now, as you may know, we are in the middle of a large membership drive, because we think City Club has so much to offer, and maybe more than ever, we'll hear more about that today, but perhaps more than ever, we have an opportunity to help citizens engage in the kinds of things that matter to all of us. Today, Jake Okenberg, who is a member of the Board of Governors, and he's chair of the membership committee, will be speaking to you a little bit more about the benefits of membership. Jake was the project director, or is currently the project director for the Oregon Business Council, and he helps coordinate the Oregon Business Plan. He has a BS in political science from Pomona College, and he served as student body president of that organization his senior year 2 years ago. Jake Okenberg.
Hello. What a week it has been. To put it mildly, the people supporting Kerry had record turnout, only to find out that the people supporting Bush had even higher record turnout. People knocking on doors, phone banking, talking to their friends. People I know traveling to swing states, going all the way to Florida to spend a weekend or a week getting people out to vote. Tremendous amount of energy. I think the shoes that I have sitting in front of the heater at home are just beginning to dry out from the canvassing I did in the rain. It's been an amazing time. It's been an amazing last year. It's been an amazing last few weeks. So much energy, so much interest. And it would be very sad and truly depressing if all that ended the day of the election. We have to find ways to challenge and channel our energies. And it has to be sustainable. It can't be something that is fixed on a date or fixed on an election every 2 or 4 years. It's the beauty of City Club. We actually have an outlet for our energies and our intellect now. We can continue to do great research. We can continue to listen to great speakers, engage on the issues. And so for those of you who are not members, I would ask you to consider joining our club. For those of you listening or watching, please join us. What a great gift that you can give to someone that you know who might be exhilarated with the output of the election or absolutely depressed, a gift of a City Club membership. So I hope you will join us. There's membership forms here. If you're watching, you can go to pdxcityclub.org and sign up right online. Thank you very much.
All right, now on for today's program. Our guests are Professor Bill Lunch. Bill is the chair of the Political Science Department at Oregon State University. He's a political analyst for Oregon Public Broadcasting and has been since 1988. I'm sure you've all heard him. He's also been heard on National Public Radio, Northwest Public Affairs Network, on Canadian National Radio, and BBC. In his academic work and teaching at Oregon State, he emphasizes American national political institutions, Northwest regional politics, and environmental, natural resource, and science policy. He's very popular with his students, and who voted him the outstanding faculty member one year, and another time they voted him one of their top profs for his teaching and advising. He's published in a number of periodicals and newspapers, and he's widely sought as a speaker on these topics. And Bill has appeared with us before, but I believe this is the first time for you, isn't it, Jeff?
No, I've
No?
done it before.
Oh, well, I should have lip-synced on that one.
You weren't president then.
Okay. In any case, Jeff Mapes is an award-winning journalist who has a really good memory. And he is the chief political reporter for the Oregonian, and he's covered Congress and various federal agencies for newspapers in several states before coming to the Oregonian in 1984. He holds a bachelor's in journalism at from San Jose State University. He's covered 7 sessions of the biennial legislature, as well as numerous gubernatorial, senatorial, congressional, and other campaigns. He's reported on this presidential campaign, as well as 4 previous races. We're really anxious to get your input on what happened.
Okay, I'm going to go first. I'm going to talk a little bit about what happened, and then Bill's going to take it a little future-oriented. First, I just have to say that this has been a fascinating experience for me this week, and one of the things I've always enjoyed about being a political reporter is that you talk to such a wide variety of people. In the span of a half an hour, for example, I can talk to the campaign managers, say, of the Republican candidate for a particular office and the Democratic candidate for a particular office, which is something that the 2 campaigns themselves may never do the entire time. So I've been fascinated this week. I live in Portland, watching all these people wandering around in Portland saying, my God, how did that fellow win re-election? Nobody I know voted for this guy. And they're kind of this glazed look. I'm driving over here and listening to OPB, I know, the station of choice for Portlanders, and they have a psychologist on explaining how voters can get over the blues. And I'm thinking, well, you know, I've been to rallies featuring the president. I talk to Republicans all the time, and it all of a sudden hit me. Finally, I achieved my long dream of being a foreign correspondent. And I didn't have to learn another language. I don't need a local fixer. I don't get shot at. People are very friendly at Republican rallies. I want to tell you this, all you Democrats out here in the audience, let's all start working together a little bit. But the fact that people are wandering around Portland feeling this is really not surprising, given what I think is something that has really come into relief in this with these election results, both nationally and in Oregon. I mean, this has been accelerating for several years, and that is really the political segregation of Americans. Just to give you an example, John Kerry took about 72% of the vote in Oregon, and if my shaky math is right, that's 24 percentage, I'm sorry, in Multnomah County, I want to say, that's 24 percentage points higher than his national showing, 21 percentage points higher than in the rest of the state of Oregon. I've done some research. There has never been such a gap between the national or the state vote and what the Democratic candidate has done in Multnomah County. As recently as 1976, when Jimmy Carter ran for president against Gerald Ford, Carter ran 1% better in Multnomah County than he did nationwide, 3% better than in the state. So, I mean, just a huge difference. And there was a rather path-breaking study that was done by a reporter for the Austin American-Statesman early this year, where he analyzed every single county in the United States and their election returns since, I think, 1948, and found that in 1976, when we sort of reached the point where Americans of all political faiths lived more closely together, something like 25% of only 25% of Americans lived in counties where one of the candidates won in a landslide, which he defined as being over 60%. So in other words, 75% of the people lived in counties where there were reasonably close races. In 2000, it was almost 46% of voters, so we're getting almost close to half of voters living in landslide counties. And I suspect that that's going to accelerate even a little bit more this time as we are able to crunch the numbers and get the final results in. So the first thing I think you really have to understand about the election returns is just what a huge schism there is out there generally between urban America and suburban, I'd say almost exurban, because the further out you get into suburbs, the more Republicans it gets, and rural areas. And this is no more true than in Oregon. And as I cited on the Kerry figures there, I mean, you had once again, a lot of Republicans that I've talked to since Tuesday feeling kind of angry at Multnomah County, just as there are people in Multnomah County right now feeling kind of upset because of the opposite results. I had one Republican I was talking to today, and he says, it's just a small little county. And I said, well, it has more people here than anywhere else in Oregon. It's roughly around a fifth of the state's population. Yeah, but it's small and landmass. It's just this tiny little thing, and so this is something that we're going to have to grapple with as a state, and we've been grappling for several years, where increasingly not only are voters having trouble talking to each other, but the legislators get to Salem, and they have trouble talking to each other because they come from areas of the state where there is a very, very clear political philosophy. Their voters aren't too interested in them sort of moving more toward the middle or common ground. And in fact, there were some Republican legislators who discovered this year what happens when they make common ground with the Democrats on taxes. They get beat in primaries. I've talked to more than one Democratic legislator in Portland running for re-election, and they're worried about what's going to happen on their left. So I think that's one important aspect of the election. Then I'll throw a whole different curve at you and talk a little bit about the ballot measures, which were kind of a fascinating mixture all over the board. I had a story in the paper the other day where I talked about the state going Democratic in candidate races and kind of going Republican when it came to the ballot measures, which I think is true in many ways. Now, you have to look sort of at every single issue because each one in politics has its peculiarities to it. Let's start with Measure 36, which was the measure to ban gay marriage in Oregon. I believe there were 11 states altogether that had those on the ballot. A lot of Republicans regarded that as a very important part of their turnout efforts. And there was some evidence that I think that may well have been indeed been the case. Oregon was a little different than these other states because the opponents put up their most determined campaign here. They really saw Oregon as the one state where they could make a difference on this, where they perhaps had a chance of fighting it. In the end, I'm not so sure that they moved the electorate much here. It was a 57% yes vote, if I'm remembering my numbers properly. And that was not hugely different from where the polls showed it at the beginning of the race. I mean, the truth is that this is an issue that I think most Democratic strategists would say, no, this is not what we wanted the election fought on, that this is really not where the majority of people are culturally in this country of supporting the idea of gay marriage. And I think that was really borne out by the election returns. Clearly, with that kind of vote, there were a lot of people who voted for John Kerry and also voted to ban gay marriage, voted yes on 36. So, and that'll be very interesting. Hopefully we might be able to get a little more data on some point on who those voters are. I know, for example, that the sponsor of Measure 36, or rather the fellow Tim Nashif who ran the campaign, told me that when they were gathering signatures, they did a lot of their outreach through some of the African American churches in Portland. And he says, we registered a lot of Democrats when we were doing that ballot measure, and we know those people are not going to vote for President Bush in the fall. So it'll be very interesting. I mean, was that one place that they picked up votes among Catholic voters? Nationally, Catholic voters were more split this time, so you might have had some of that. So that'll be kind of interesting to get a little more information about that. Probably the most far-reaching measure, I think, that passed, and I know one that Bill will talk a lot more about what happens now with that, was Measure 37, the property rights measure that says if government reduces the value, or if the value of your land is reduced through government regulation, then you either have to be compensated or the regulation has to be removed. And that just swept everywhere in Oregon. It won in Multnomah County, rather barely here. It was 61 or 60-39, I believe, 60.5, 39.5. It was a 21-point spread, and that is really quite a landslide win for it. Now, you can argue that in many different ways. I think on one hand, it very much reflected Oregonians' sort of libertarianism, that they kind of, in many ways in this state, we want to be left alone, and we're going to leave our neighbors alone, and I think that very much played into those kinds of feelings. They had a great ballot title, and I was talking to one of the strategists working on the other side, and she was saying, the first three words of that, government must pay. Boy, was there a message for this electorate this time. Government must pay, and that just fed into a lot of people, and it's a difficult issue to understand in many ways, and I think in the end that was one. Certainly, I think you'll find that Republicans were more likely to support it than Democrats were, but it clearly had strong support throughout the state, and I'm not even sure that you can say that this really accurately describes where the state is going on a lot of issues. But it once again shows that Oregonians very much pick their way through ballot measures individually, and that they're not always predictable. As the sort of a proof of that, I think Measure 35, which the medical malpractice initiative, that was the one that would have put a cap on what you could win in non-economic damages in a medical malpractice case. And once again, I mean, the president campaigned very heavily on that issue in the national arena. Democrats opposed that issue. You could argue, just as property rights was more of a Republican issue, that this medical malpractice initiative was also a Republican issue, and Democrats were against it. There, the voters came down almost 50-50. It ended up losing very narrowly. And you know, I think once again people just kind of picked their way through it, looked at it, and I'm not sure that necessarily tells you anything about the Oregon electorate. The last one of the ballot measures, well, I'll talk about two more. Real quickly, our Measure 38 to get rid of the state-funded workers' comp insurer. I think, frankly, that thing was kind of doomed from the start. You have businesses throughout the state that are insured by SAFE, very worried about what was going to happen if the state insurance company was put out of business. And so I think that literally had a ready-made constituency against that in every community, every Kiwanis club, every Rotary club throughout the state. Measure 34, the measure dealing with the state forests that would have put more environmental restrictions on their use. We've seen a number of these kind of initiatives over the last decade, and unless I'm remembering wrong, literally just about every one of them has been defeated. What really kind of happens with these is environmentalists put measures on the ballot. Timber industry, ranching, other kind of natural resource folks run very heavy, raise a lot of money to fight these initiatives. They become a very important organizing tool in rural Oregon that I think a lot of people miss. You know, they don't tend to get a huge amount of attention in the metropolitan area, but they get a lot of attention in rural areas, big signs and that sort of thing. And once again, it gets a very, very strong no vote outside the metropolitan areas, and people inside the metro areas, particularly after exposure to a lot of advertising, you know, are more split on these sort of things, and so they end up losing. And then, real lastly, I'll talk just a little bit about the candidate races, the other ones. As I said, I mean, it was a good day generally for Democratic candidates in Oregon. They won all of the statewide offices that were up for election really quite handily. Won 4 out of 5 of the congressional races, including 2 races where Democratic incumbents received quite well-financed challenges. Gained 3 seats in the state Senate to take firm control of the state Senate, gained 2 seats in the House. Once again, I think you really almost have to look at all of those situations individually. In the legislature, the Democrats were helped to some degree by the redistricting plan that the Secretary of State did in 2001. That was an important factor there. Also, though, I think the races where the Democrats did win, I think they were helped by the turnout efforts that the Democrats did, particularly once again in counties where they thought they would do well, ranging from the Ashland area down in Jackson County up to the Portland metropolitan area. And I do think that made something of a difference in those races. You know, in the congressional races, I think to some degree it proves once again that incumbents are very difficult to beat. There are a lot of advantages there. And on the statewide races, frankly, the Republicans just didn't do a very good job of recruiting. And you could argue in the Secretary of State's race, they did have 2 fairly well-known candidates in the primary. They chose the more conservative candidate who really had the less chance of attracting financing to her candidacy. And so I think that hurt them there. And with that, I will let Bill talk about the future.
Well, futurology or futurism is probably one of these kinds of phrases that we ought to use with considerable caution. The foreseeable future, it seems to me, since we're meeting here today at the noon hour, might extend till 1 o'clock, but don't ask Mount St. Helens because you can't always tell. So I'm going to have to give you some impressions of what seems to me at least to be likely, but with very significant caveats, that we've all gotten surprised in politics repeatedly, and the next surprise may be in the headline that Jeff writes for the Oregonian tomorrow. With that, let me say that to go back to something that he mentioned that's very much related to what we saw here in Oregon among our neighbors to the north in Washington and to some extent in California, the red states, we've sort of reversed. For those of us who remember the Cold War, the color coding has gotten reversed. You know, it used to be that the reds were on the left, and I suppose if we use that color, the blues were on the right. Well, because of just the choice of colors one year by map makers who do these things for newspapers and for broadcasts, I guess the TV networks now, the blues on the left and the reds on the right, go figure. But in any event, the red states got redder, that is to say more conservative. And the blue states, including all of them here on the Pacific coast, got bluer, that is to say more liberal and more democratic. Now overall, if you look at the election returns nationally, the Republicans did marginally better, but marginally better was enough for them to pick up seats in the United States Senate, including out here on the West Coast among our neighbors up in Alaska, where apparently Lisa Murkowski, the daughter of the former senator and now governor, has apparently won election to the U.S. Senate on her own. But across the country, the Republicans are evidently going to pick up 5 seats in the United States Senate, and that's pretty significant. And in the U.S. House of Representatives, similarly, they're going to pick up 4 or 5 seats. It's not as important because the numbers are larger and their control was assured anyway. Let me, just because I happen to have mentioned this first, let me then turn to the national consequences for Oregon and the Northwest of the outcome that we've just seen. Given that the Bush administration has been given another 4 years and President Bush read his election in 2000 very broadly, you will recall that he lost the popular vote but carried the Electoral College 4 years ago. This time he's won the popular vote and the Electoral College, and based upon a press conference that he had yesterday, he's going to be very aggressive about pushing his agenda. So I think that for the Northwest, one of the things that may mean is that to the extent there are regional interests here that depend upon prior practices that we're used to. For example, we've been the beneficiaries in this region of cheap electric power because of the operation of the dams and so on by the Bonneville Power Administration that then sells power to both private and public utilities inexpensively. There's been an ideological drive among conservative Republicans for some considerable length of time now, at least reaching back to the Reagan administration, to privatize BPA. And that's been very unpopular here in the Northwest, including among Republicans and conservatives, because it would be economically very, very costly for us. So what that means is that we are going to be more reliant in Oregon on our Republican Senator, Gordon Smith. His importance rises as a national spokesman for the region as a result of this election. Keep in mind that up in Washington, they have 2 Democratic senators. We have a Republican and a Democrat, and in California, our neighbors to the south, there are 2 Democratic senators. So that Gordon Smith is the only Republican senator on the entire Pacific coast, and that, unless you count Alaska, which is a little bit different area. That means that Gordon Smith is going to be a more important figure. Greg Walden is who got reelected, as Jeff indicated. All the incumbents did. The only even modest surprise there was that Congressman David Wu from the 1st District was hit with a sex scandal or revelation of things that went on about 30 years ago when he was a college student. It was thought he might be vulnerable, but it turned out that his adversary was not able to use those charges or those revelations in a way that really endangered him. In fact, his numbers went back up after she began running ads that included those charges. So all of the incumbents of the 5 members of the U.S. House of Representatives got reelected. Of those 5, the one who will be the most important in terms of connections to and perhaps ability to have some influence on the second Bush administration will be Greg Walden from the eastern and southern Oregon district, which is enormous physically. In fact, it's bigger than 29 states, for those of you who are interested in such thing. You could take a lot of Delaware and put it into the second district in Oregon and probably have room left over to spare. So that's on the national level. On the state level, the Democrats, having increased their margins in created a margin in the state Senate. We went from a 15-15 tie, as Jeff was saying, to 18 Democrats, 12 Republicans in the state Senate. What that will mean is two things that I can see now. One is that on certain limited questions, the life of the governor and the other Democrats will be easier. Most notably, that'll be on executive appointments. The Republicans with a 15-15 tie could and did hold up appointments that the governor wanted to make, at least make life uncomfortable, sometimes extract compromises and bargains from the governor on those kinds of positions. That won't be possible for them to do any longer. So for Ted Kulongoski, the coming into being of a renewed Democratic majority, the last time they had one was 10 years ago, in the state Senate is a welcome development. On the other hand, the Republicans, though they lost a couple seats, have retained the majority that they had, not as big a majority, but they still retain the majority in the state House. We saw in the 2003 legislative session the longest legislative session we've ever had, and one of the most bitter, divisive, and difficult. But records are made to be broken. And my guess is that the Republicans in the State House will now take it as their charge to stop what the governor and the Democrats in the State Senate want to do. And so we are likely to see a very long, very divisive, very nasty legislative session. One of the developments which Jeff alluded to but didn't explicitly mention that occurred in the House elections was that where there were moderate Republicans who, for example, voted for the tax increase that brought the 2003 session to its conclusion to balance the state budget, later overturned on a referendum. That was Measure 30 that folks voted on some months later. The Republicans who voted for that tax increase, in some cases took administrative appointments and left. They resigned from the legislature to go to work for the state government, such as Lane Shetterly from Polk County, Len Hannon, who retired from the state Senate. There were Max Williams from the Portland suburbs, the southern Portland suburbs. So there were a number of moderates who left quite voluntarily to take other jobs. But then beyond that, there were primary challenges, and in at least one case, a Republican who voted for that tax package who was defeated in the general election largely as a result of objections to that. The consequence of that is that we have 33 Republicans in the State House, where we had 35 before, but ideologically they are a much more consistently conservative bunch than the 35 who were there in '03. So that the State House has basically moved to the right. The State Senate, with the addition of the 3 Democrats, has moved to the left. We've got the same governor, who's always been something of a moderate and a guy who looks for bargains and compromises, and he's going to get lots of exercise trying to do that in the 2005 session. My suspicion is that as good as Ted Kulongoski is at trying to find bargains and middle ground, he's going to be a very busy and not necessarily terribly successful fella for the first few months of the session. So for those of you who are either already engaged in careers as lobbyists or who are thinking about descending to that level, let me make a suggestion, which is that you not plan any August vacations. So in the state legislative races, or the prospects for the '05 legislative session are quite good for political analysts, but not necessarily good for the rest of the state. One last note that I thought I would add, and then we can turn to the questions and so forth. We should keep in mind that floating out there, sort of now kind of half forgotten, but nonetheless very real, is a case to resolve the challenges to the changes that were made in the public employees retirement system by the '03 legislature. Those were challenged by public employee unions and the people who represent those who would be adversely affected if those changes went into full effect. That decision has not been rendered by the state Supreme Court. The rumor in official Salem, and Jeff can correct me if he's heard differently, has been that the Supreme Court was waiting for the elections to be over before issuing their opinion or their decision in this case, and that means probably, but they want to do it before the next legislature has to start grappling with a very difficult state budget, somewhere between $500 million to $1 billion, depending on estimates that you make, in deficit. And so I think that in the next couple months, we can expect the state Supreme Court to come down with its PERS decision, and that may or may not, we don't know what they're going to decide, add to the size of the deficit a bit that the legislature would have to deal with. There are other things to be said, but I know this is a very well-informed group of folks who will ask excellent questions, so I think it's time to turn to your questions.
Yes, it is now time for the question and answer session, and I would like to remind you that, first of all, only City Club members have the privilege of asking questions, and I would ask that you curb your enthusiasm when it comes to commenting and make these questions. Our Board of Governors host today is Norma Paulus. She will have the opportunity to ask the first question. Norma was elected to the state legislature in 1970 and served 6 years, after which she was not elected as Secretary of State, the first woman elected to a statewide office in Oregon. And to make further history, she instituted the nation's first ever vote by mail, which I think maybe the rest of the country should take a good look at after standing in line for 9 hours. She received the Republican nomination for governor in 1986, but lost in a very close election, and then was elected state superintendent of public schools in 1990. She's now chairwoman of the Oregon Road Scholar Selection Committee, and she recently served as the director of the Oregon Historical Society. So, Norma, welcome.
Well, after the Supreme Court handed down Roe versus Wade, this state has consistently supported it. And so my question relates to that decision. My understanding is that, of the law, that even if Roe versus Wade were overturned by the Supreme Court due to decisions made by the president in the appointment process, that Oregon's law would still stand and it would still be legal in this state. But it would make us a very lonely state. So my question to you is, and I understand how important Gordon Smith will be now to the state of Oregon, but it's my sense that he could be very vulnerable in his reelection efforts if the metropolitan area really focused in on Roe versus Wade and began a relentless lobbying effort with him to vote against any appointment that would overturn it. But are there other Republican senators that would be that vulnerable now in the Senate with the margin that the Republicans have? That's my question.
Well, Jack Reed in Rhode Island, perhaps. You know, Arlen Specter caused a little bit of a fuss when he said that he would. At first, it sounded like at his post-election press conference that he said he wouldn't appoint, or he's kind of set to be the incoming chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and that he wouldn't support any nominee who wanted to overturn Roe versus Wade. And then he said, "No, you're taking the wrong implication, and I'm not saying that at all." So it's already become something of a controversy in the Republican caucus. I don't know how all that's going to turn out. I mean, Republicans. You know, one thing I was struck with after the election, I get emails from just about every political group under the sun. You know, they've all learned to send out daily emails to reporters around the country, and I was struck by the number of pro-life groups sending out emails saying, now we've really got to put President Bush's feet to the fire and Congress's feet to the fire to move on abortion. You know, what they got was rhetorical support in the first administration, and I think they're very much looking for more in the second administration. So I don't know how it may turn out, but it may not be just a question of what the Supreme Court rules, but what kind of federal actions does Congress make? And at that point, I think Gordon Smith could be very directly affected, because it would, you know, it could be an actual bill that he has to vote on rather than an appointment, which might, you know, might be a little bit disconnected from the decision made on that.
Let me add on this that the debate over abortion is in many ways a symbolic debate over the status of women in society and the changes that have gone on in the lives of women in the last approximately 35 years since they were inadvertently and accidentally included in the coverage of the Civil Rights Bill, It was an accident. For those of you, I won't go into all the details because we don't have time, but it was an accident, a mistake by the opponents of the Civil Rights Bill, who thought that by adding women to the coverage of the bill, it would kill the bill. To their horror, shock, and amazement, the bill then passed. And that's why it is that my university has a women's soccer team. But I digress. The point of this is that issues having to do, whether there ought to be women's sports teams at colleges, which is still a live issue for a lot of folks, or the legality of abortion, or whether women ought to be admitted to military academies such as the Citadel and Virginia Military Institute, which was a live issue just a little while ago. All of those issues are connected in terms of the attitudes of folks who are opposed to these changes that have gone on in the relationships between men and women over the last number of decades. And it is an interesting question to think about because we have not had to confront this since a long time ago. The last time there was a serious political engagement over these issues, at least as far as I can tell, was in 1989, 1990 when the Supreme Court came down with a case that is known as Webster. It came out of Missouri and appeared to be a forerunner, a foreshadowing of Roe being overturned in the next session of the Supreme Court. The political reaction against Republicans in the 1990 election was sufficient to get the National Republican Party to back off of those positions. But given the centrality of religious conservatives to the coalition that the Republicans have assembled, particularly in the South and the Midwest, it seems to me that it would be politically impossible for the National Republican Party to do that now. So there may be, I think Secretary Paulus in her usual perceptive way, looking out on the horizon, I think very accurately, has identified a key issue that may be very important, conceivably as early as the 2006 midterm elections.
In order for us to get in as many questions as possible, please try to be succinct in your questions. Tim Krause here and Cullen Brady here have live mics, and so if you'll just raise your hand for the questions, one of them will bring it to you.
Gordon Smith is going to play a major role in some other major issues like Steve Novak, City Club member. Gordon Smith is going to play a role in other major issues like partial privatization of Social Security, cutting taxes on the investment income of the wealthy, and defying Oregon voters to pass medical malpractice, quote, reform. Historically, the Oregonian is a great paper that doesn't cover the congressional delegation at all. Do you think that the paper might put a bit of a spotlight on Senator Smith, given the major national role he'll be playing with other moderate Republicans on this issue, these issues?
Well, first off, I reject your characterization. We may not. Steve is a very sharp mind and has strong ideas on what we should be covering, and I always appreciate his input. No, I think he is right that Gordon Smith is in a very important role, and as Bill mentioned, is the only senator on the West Coast from Washington, of the Washington, California, Oregon delegations. I mean, I think the Republicans are anxious to have him remain there, and at the same time, he's got to walk kind of a careful balancing act. Our own paper today quoted him from a story that one of our Washington reporters did. So there is some coverage saying that he's been getting a lot of heat for not supporting the president on drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And so that's, yet sort of another fine dividing line he's got to walk. But I also have to remember, once again, you're sort of talking about the blue part of Oregon, and there's also the red part of Oregon, as I talked about earlier, and Gordon Smith has very strong support there. So I think it's a little too simplistic to say, well, if Gordon Smith doesn't act like a Democrat, he's going to be in political trouble. I don't think that's the case at all.
Hi, Gil Johnson, City Club member. I want to follow up on Bill's prediction about the Oregon legislature and ask Jeff if there are 4 or 5 rational and courageous Republicans in the Oregon House that will work with the governor and the Senate Democrats to get some kind of budget resolution that will be reasonable, worked out, and even if that's possible, given the control of the House by the fairly right-wing majority there.
Well, you know, they do have to come to a resolution on the budget at some point, and that's one reason that the last session was so long. You know, the conservatives there were not able to come up. I mean, they never, you know, they never passed out of the legislature a Republican budget that would balance the budget within their current revenues. I mean, that they did not send the governor such a bill because it's very hard to do that. And I mean, I can give you chapter and verse about all the things that ways you say you want to control government spending, but when you get right down to it, they're all very difficult things to do. And they're going to have to come to a balanced budget again. Now, the way they got out of the building last time was, I mean, frankly, the Speaker of the House allowed a group of so-called moderate Republicans to join with the Democrats. I mean, she could have shut that process down, but she didn't. To join with a group of Democrats to pass out a tax bill that the Republican majority in the House could wash its hands of, and of course then it ended up on the ballot, and you know the rest is history on that. But I guess what I'm saying is they are going to have to come to some agreement on the budget. Republicans don't want to raise taxes, but they also find how difficult it is to balance a budget within existing revenue, and that'll be the tension there. How it gets resolved out, well, I mean, I don't think anybody can predict.
Hi, Jane C., City Club member. I guess I want to be unpragmatic with this question. There's a television program called Jack and Bobby, and in that, it's not until 2040 that Bobby gets elected president and brings the country back from the divide. So by that time I'll be 104. But I don't want to wait that long. If there is any possibility that the president can resist some of the beating up from his conservative religious supporters about all of those issues, about pushing forward those issues that are so divisive for the country, are there other things that you two could see that he could push for that would be more unifying than dividing? I mean, 59 million votes versus 56 million votes is a very small margin, and it's still a big divide. Got any ideas, or are you just going to be pessimistic?
It's always very difficult to predict what any person elected president is going to do. It's particularly difficult, it turns out, the historians will tell you, in the second term of an administration, because characteristically, though not in absolutely every case, but most of the time, the second term turns out to be a kind of a follow-on and oftentimes a disappointment because the best ideas, or at least the most saleable, the most politically palatable ideas that an administration has are usually presented in the first half or in the first 4 years, usually, in fact, in the first 2 years. The ideas that the Bush administration has put forward that President Bush seems to have a personal attachment to and that he mentioned in his press conference yesterday include more tax cuts and making the tax cuts that were enacted about 3 years ago permanent, which would have some profound effects on the nation's deficit. But he seems really invested in that. That's very important to him, and I suspect that there'll be a good deal of lobbying effort by the administration to basically overcome a Democratic filibuster. The only thing the Democrats have left at the national level is the ability to filibuster in the Senate. The House is under very strict organizational control, and the Republicans can and will thoroughly disregard and pay no attention, basically, to the Democrats in the House. In the Senate, however, because of the filibuster rule, if the Democrats are united, which they frequently are not, but if they are united, they can stop the Republicans from passing at least some big-ticket items. So I think one of the big controversies, I don't know how it's going to be resolved, but I have a guess, but is that President Bush will put a lot of political capital into the attempt to either further deepen and or make permanent the tax cuts that were enacted a few years ago. The other major component of this administration's attention, at least as far as I can tell, has been on Iraq and the Middle East more generally. And yesterday we already had some discussion by some of the insiders in the foreign policy establishment, the high positions in this administration, about Iran, which is apparently on the edge of developing nuclear weapons, which would be profoundly threatening in the region, not to say the world. So the other serious problem that this president and his administration are going to have to confront is what to do about the current problems in Iraq, which are very severe, and the potential that they may grow. Given that, if those are the two major areas, if I've identified them, I may not have. I may have missed, and I think on the social side, as Secretary Paulus's question suggests, Senator, there's room for a lot of divisive activity there, heaven knows, not to make a bad pun. But leaving that aside, so my sense is if you look at what Bush has said and the people around him, all of the issues on their plate are highly divisive ones. And by the way, I'll just add as a footnote and close, that was part and parcel of the political strategy that Karl Rove, the president's political advisor, brought to the White House. His view was that if he could divide the country further, and by so doing increase turnout among religious conservatives in particular, but conservatives across the board, it would be very helpful to the political prospects for Republicans. That's a whole other topic which would take another session of at least this length to disentangle. But let me just say, he may turn out either to be right, in which case we are probably on the edge of a Republican-dominated era in our politics that will last for 30 or 35 years, or he may have misread American public opinion, in which case there'll be a backlash. But I can't tell you which.
You know, there's two things that I want to follow on that. One, on Iraq, I was talking to Gordon Smith about this a week or so ago, and I think Republicans are very hopeful that things will get better once, if elections occur there in January and are regarded as successful. So that is a very important thing to them that they're really looking forward to. If that doesn't work out well, Bill could be right that foreign policy could really continue to dominate a lot of the energy of the Bush administration. There is one thing I'm intrigued about, and it may actually lead to some bipartisan working together. You know, if we were not in the middle of a very tense international situation, I think health care would have been a major, major issue in this campaign. Health care premiums are going up like crazy, and this is not a liberal conservative issue. I mean, everybody is upset about this, from the most conservative businessman on Main Street to people who work with the most poverty-stricken people in this country. Another 5 million of whom no longer have any health coverage. So this is a huge problem, and don't look so much at what President Bush proposed in this campaign, which wasn't necessarily any huge change. Look at Bill Frist, the Senate Majority Leader. I also predict candidate for president in 2008. He has a proposal for kind of a big reinsurance plan, kind of like based on the Freddie Mac, whatever those agencies are called for home mortgages, where in essence the federal government would take over, or through this private insurer, would take over the costs of catastrophic health care. Now, very interestingly, that in some ways mirrors exactly what John Kerry was proposing during the campaign, where he wanted the federal government to pay, I think it was 70% of the cost of medical expenses over, I think, $30,000, and then it would rise to $50,000 over 4 years. The idea being, that what is really driving this system now are insurers' fears of getting stuck with a really expensive case, and that is just distorting the whole healthcare system. And if you can kind of remove that fear away from it, you'll have a much more healthy and, pardon another bad pun, much more healthy health insurance market. And that you will, you know, instead of having insurers try to figure out how not to get stuck with a really sick person, they will be devoting their energies to trying to figure out how can we market the most smart plans, how can we really focus on prevention, etc. Would also drive down the costs to businesses to provide health insurance, because once again, so many of the costs in the healthcare system. Now, this is all the devil in the detail. I don't know if they can work something out, but I think this is getting to a crisis point where they can't ignore this issue, and I think they really almost have no choice but in some fashion to deal with it in a bipartisan fashion.
I see that you continue to be an optimist, Jeff.
My name's Tom Cox. I'm a City Club member and Libertarian. You talked earlier about the State House being more ideologically firmly in the grip of the right-wing Republicans, and you felt that that would be a problem for passing a budget. But some of the most staunch fiscal conservatives, like Jeff Krupp, Derek Kitts, have signed on to the nonpartisan New Budget Coalition, which has put forth some ideas to change the budget process and make it easier to reach a balanced budget and to compromise with the governor. And in fact, it has provisions in there that mirror the work being done by the Oregon Progress Board. Do you see that as a hopeful development? Do you think that there's a hope that that can, in fact, break through some of this gridlock and give us a decent budget?
The change in the budget process, which has been proposed by the group to which Mr. Cox refers, is initially a serious proposal, because it would move to, and I'm doing some violence to the details here, but let me just see if I can explain this. Those of you with long memories may recall that at the start of the Carter administration, so this is in the mid-70s, there was an idea out there called zero-based budgeting, that you would start with essentially nothing as the budget for any agency, and then see what they do, how many people they serve, what functions they provide for the society, and based upon that, build a budget. And in some cases, it might be nothing, because you'd say this organization, this agency isn't doing anything for the society. Let's get rid of it. Well, it's a nice idea, but what happened, and Carter was very interested in these kinds of ideas. He was a president who, more than any in prior memory, at least for me, cared a great deal about the details of government management. And what developed was that the agencies ended up with largely the same budgets as they'd had before, despite zero-based budgeting. The reason is the agencies are serving constituencies in the society, and are serving people who either need those services or are in a position to demand them. So it's a good point of departure, but I have grave doubts based upon what happened at the national level when a similar effort was made, if it will make any difference to the '05 legislative struggle over the budget.
Yeah, I just real quickly say, you know, once again, it gets down to the same problem when you really get down to implementing anything, the same problem, you know, we have in our household. We've got all sorts of great ideas for monthly budgets and processes and everything we're going to follow, but in the end, it means, you know, you don't go out to eat as often, you don't buy clothes, you don't, you know, one thing or another, and I mean, in the end, it comes down to real money being spent on real people, and that always gets to be the difficult thing there.
Yeah, hi. David Poole, City Club member.
We have 45 seconds left.
I was wondering if you could comment on the selection of Kate Brown or Peter Courtney and what that might mean for the Senate, what their choice might mean, and what that might mean in terms of the divisiveness you were talking about.
10 seconds.
Why are you so sure that it will be one of those two? Very possible that they will be deadlocked and they'll turn to a third person. There you go.
We still have a few. You have a comment, Bill?
This is internecine politics among 18 people, considerably fewer than are there in this room, so the interpersonal dynamics become very important and highly imponderable for those of us who are outside the room.
Sorry that we have to cut this short. What I would like to say is that you can get these programs on tape, audio and video, through City Club. I've had a lot of requests for Jim Garrison from last week, America is Empire. Fascinating. So thank you very much, gentlemen, and may the force be with us.